country where the president sees the traffickers as victims of the users, the Minister of Justice and Public Security refuses to call them terrorists. The STF imposes barriers to police actions in the communities, and large sectors of the left glorify criminals while demonizing the police. Are we condemned? Or we could follow examples that worked, classifying factions like the PCC and the CV as terrorist organizations, opening the way for much tougher actions and punishments against their members. Let's start with the fact that this discussion detonated the contention operation in the Penha and Alamo complex in Rio de Janeiro, which took place on this Tuesday, October 28th. According to official reports in the press, more than 2,000 civil and military police officers with the support of the BOP entered into confrontation with the Red Command, resulting in 132 deaths, of which 4 policemen, 2 civilians, and 2 of the BOP. A number that promises to increase, with more bodies of bandits being found in nearby forest areas. More than 80 traffickers and dozens of rifles were also arrested. During the operation, the traffickers reviled with strong and heavy firepower, with high-caliber weapons, grenades, and even armed drones being used by the traffickers, transforming urban areas into authentic war zones. But unfortunately, this is not the novelty in Brazil, where urban violence kills more than in many armed conflicts around the world. With more than 40,000 homicides registered in the country in 2024, many linked to drug trafficking. Brazil faces a security crisis that goes beyond the common crime, with factions like the First Command of the capital and the Red Command controlling entire territories, with paramilitary structures highly organized. The PCC, born in the Paulus prisons in the early 90s, expanded to 22 Brazilian states and operates internationally, with alliances in Bolivia and Paraguay. The Rio's CV dominates communities and uses urban guerrilla tactics, employing drones armed with bombs, grenades against policemen in crowded neighborhoods, using civilians as human shields, forcing residents to stay in the front line during the confrontations, and extorting merchants with protection rates under the penalty of execution. This is not a mere crime, it is territorial control, mass intimidation, and destabilization of the state, classic characteristics of terrorism. But the federal government, under Lula, adopts a lenient posture, with the president recently affirming that traffickers are victims of the users, forced to retreat hours later after the negative repercussion of his speech. The Minister of Justice and Public Security, Ricardo Lewandowski, who should be the first to demand more firm and extreme measures, claims that factions like the PCC and the CV cannot be confused with terrorists because the Brazilian law differentiates them, referring that according to the Constitution, terrorists have ideological or political motivation, while factions seek profit. Leftist parties like PSOL often criticize the police and try to create even more difficulties for police action against the trafficking. A vision that ignores reality, because these factions are not simple criminals, they are authentic irregular armies. But what is the difficulty of the Brazilian government in calling these factions for what they really are? Terrorist organizations. Law 13.260/2016, the so-called Brazilian anti-terrorism law, defines terrorism as acts that, for xenophobic, discriminatory, religious, racial, or political reasons, aim to provoke social or generalized terror, exposing people, heritage, or public peace to extreme danger. But the PCC and the CV prove they provoke terror in whole communities, using weapons of high caliber in urban areas, throwing grenades in super-crowded neighborhoods and employing drones with explosives, creating collective panic. They force merchants to pay extortion under death threats. They force families to abandon houses to use as bases and hide behind civilians, using men, women, old people, and innocent children as human shields to hinder police operations. This is all terrorist coaction, similar to what groups like Hamas do in Gaza, and not a mere economic crime, as the Lula government claims. Internationally, the UN has no unique definition, but conventions treat terrorism as criminal acts that create a state of terror in the population, regardless of profit, such as attacks with explosives or weapons to intimidate and limit the state's action. Besides, the government's argument that factions seek profit ignores that drug trafficking finances political control, with the PCC infiltrating prefectures to obtain contracts and with the CV openly challenging the state. There are projects that try to reverse this, such as the Law Project 724/25, which proposes to include narco-terrorism in the definition, recognizing that trafficking finances terrorist acts, a measure that would allow the application of much heavier sentences from 12 to 30 years, and unfeasible, and the resource to much harder and incisive combat measures, even involving the direct action of the armed forces, not as mere coadjuvants or for more peripheral missions, but as an acting offensive force in direct combat. And in addition, it would facilitate international cooperation and the application of sanctions against groups, individuals, and companies linked to these factions. These measures are nothing new and have already been successfully tested in other countries, with a highlight for El Salvador, with Nayib Bukele transforming the most dangerous country in the world into the second safest in the Americas, behind only Canada. But to do this, Bukele was forced to take extreme measures, declaring the state of emergency in 2022, classifying gangs like MS-13 as terrorists, arresting 70,000 members and building the mega prison Sakat. The result was a drop of 90% of homicides, dropping from 106 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2015 to less than 3 in 2016-2025. In the United States, Trump classified cartels such as the Train of Aragua and Cartel de los Soles as narco-terrorist organizations, allowing direct military actions and much broader and tougher financial sanctions. The American government tried to convince the Brazilian government to do the same with the PCC and the CV, but Lula refused, ignoring that these groups operate transnationally, financing terror. Recognizing these factions as terrorist groups could be part of the solution, opening the doors for the application of much more severe penalties. The use of the armed forces in direct confrontation actions and international cooperation with other nations, also interested in ending drug trafficking. In summary, to classify the PCC and the CV as terrorists is not radicalism, it is military and geopolitical realism, because they are authentic paramilitary armies, heavily armed, highly organized, infiltrated in the state, and applying terrorist methods against civilians. The Brazilian government makes mistakes when treating them as simple criminals, with international examples proving that there is a solution, but demands courage to act before the narco-terrorism wins. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news.